What did you make of this last-minute intervention from the European Court of Human Rights?
Well, first of all, what did I make? The government must have been completely frustrated. They had set out their plan, they had made arrangements, and then to be stopped at the very last minute by, I think it's called a Section 39 interim order from Strasbourg must have been so frustrating for them, I have to say. I mean, there is, and I was reading Priti Patel's article in the Daily Telegraph this morning. She's given an interview where she says there is an element of racism in the attacks that are coming from the left and indeed from other institutions that should know better, because there have been plans before with this policy, but there hasn't been the hyperbole that we've heard over this policy. And indeed, I was glad also to see a government spokesperson for Rwanda itself speak out and say, look, how dare you criticise our country? If you want to criticise our country, come and see it, but don't do it from afar. So I think government are now looking at a Bill of Rights, a domestic Bill of Rights to replace the Human Rights Act. I think that's good. But the question is, will that replace the ability for this Section 39 interim order to come in? Because, of course, it's international law. So they have to be very careful that when they're drafting the new bill, that it deals with the possibility of Strasbourg putting their oar in at the very last minute.
Absolutely. And Paul, I want to come back to that point there that Ali made about the Rwandan government sort of hitting back, because we've discussed this on the show before, that, you know, if asylum seekers were being sent to, I don't know, the Netherlands or Sweden or something, it feels like there'd be much less uproar, doesn't it?
I think that's probably true, actually. I think Priti Patel used the example of Sydney and New York, and I think in those circumstances the protests would probably be a bit more muted. There does seem to be some kind of unconscious racism in the idea of people saying you shouldn't send people to this African hellhole almost. Perhaps not realising the implications of what they're saying. I mean, on the point about Strasbourg, I think it is actually quite disturbing that you can have a situation where two national courts in the UK, the High Court and the Court of Appeal, both saw no legitimate reason to intervene at that stage and to grant interim relief to the claimants, and effectively said that, you know, this flight could go ahead. And then what appears to be the on-duty judge in Strasbourg at the last minute steps in and says, no, we are going to stop that from happening. And effectively, for the time being at least, to stop an elected government carrying out its policy. And if it is the case that the European Convention on Human Rights does allow that sort of thing, then it seems to me that the writ is running too large. And I think there's another potential dispute further down the line. You know, in terms of the wider policy, because obviously we know that the High Court has said the legalities of the policy need to be reviewed, and I think that review will take place in July. What happens then if the High Court and possibly the Court of Appeal again both say, actually, this policy is okay legally, there's no reason to stop it from being implemented, and the European Court of Human Rights again intervenes, which I think it has the potential to do, and says, well, actually, no, the wider policy is not consistent with the European Convention of Human Rights, then I think we're into a real dispute about who wields power and whether or not a government can be allowed to implement its policy that you know, it's got a big decisive majority, and it was elected to govern. Now, I've got misgivings about the Rwanda policy. I think many people have. But the idea, I think, that unelected European judges can intervene in this way, I think, is quite disturbing.
I think there's been a lot of feedback sort of saying the same. I think there's been some quite lazy comments saying that now that we're out of the EU, this shouldn't be happening. I think there's been confusion over the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, which are two very different things. But there have been calls for us to potentially look at removing ourselves from the European Convention on Human Rights and thus from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. But Arlene, am I not right in thinking that there would be potential implications for the Belfast Agreement if that was done?
Yes, and indeed Dan Hannan makes that point today. He's basically saying that there's only one reason to stay in the European Convention on Human Rights, and it's the fact that it is specifically mentioned in the Belfast Agreement, unlike a whole rake of other things that are not mentioned in the Belfast Agreement, but which people say are there. It is actually in the Belfast Agreement. And look, I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater here, but I think we do need to have a look at this in a sensible and reasonable way, because I think what you're seeing is judicial activism in the European Court of Human Rights. That's that's not surprising, given their role, and of course, given the role of judges in other parts of Europe, which is different from the UK. And I think people need to understand that, because judges have a different role in the Constitution. They have a different role in their countries. They take into account cultural norms in different countries, and of course, we may have different cultural norms here in the UK. So, is there a need to look at all of these things? Yes, there is, but I don't think we should rush to just throw everything out. And I also have to say this, though, I think people are saying if we left the European Convention on Human Rights that the UK would be in some way not, we wouldn't have any human rights here in the UK. Well, I mean, that's a nonsense, because we're not given human rights by the European Court of Human Rights. It just has a judicial oversight of them. We have human rights here in the UK. We're probably one of the best countries in the world for human rights and for the protection of human rights. So I think people just need to calm down, look at it rationally, look at it reasonably. There is a problem, and we need to have a good conversation about that.
Mm-hmm. So, Paul, I want to come to you to talk about sort of Labour's position on this policy, because it seemed to take Keir Starmer a very long time to finally come out with an opinion, and that opinion was if Labour get into power, they'd scrap the policy. But I know we've spoken before about the kind of lack of alternative that's being proposed by the Labour Party. Have you any idea what their plan is?
No. And the truth is, Deanna, that, look, most people, I think, on the left nowadays are pro-open borders. That's the truth of it. Very much a different position to, 20 or 30 years ago, when people on the left, socialists, trade unionists like myself, believed that regulation of the labour supply and proper border control was essential. Not least so governments can plan around welfare, employment, housing, make sure there isn't undue pressure on wages in certain sectors, and so on and so forth. That position of open borders, once upon a time, was only held by Trotskyists, anarchists and hyper-liberals. Now it's very much a mainstream position on the left, and to hold the position of control of the labour supply is almost like a fringe position. So I think many people on the left in the labour movement are quite happy to have an open borders position. But the problem is they're articulating it in bad faith, because they don't say openly, this is our position. They don't say openly, we support open borders, we think everybody should be able to come. So what they will do is they will resist particular policies or particular proposed solutions every time one is proposed, without actually saying, well, we're going to oppose everything because we're really pro-open borders. And I was struck by a protest that was taking place at Gatwick Airport at the detention centre last week, I think it was, where the protesters were basically saying no nations, no borders, no deportations. And that occasionally, the mask slips, and that really is the position. The problem for Labour, of course, is if they said, we're pro-open borders, they know that it wouldn't be popular in terms of mainstream opinion in this country. So there's a dishonesty on the left, and it really frustrates me as somebody on the left about this debate, because so much of it, I think, is taking place in bad faith.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's this point, isn't there, that it is OK to criticise and critique a policy, but if you want to be the party of government, you have to be able to present some kind of alternative, don't you?
Well, the reality is this: having a situation where thousands of people, mainly young men, are turning up on our shores undocumented every month is simply not sustainable. Now, you can be compassionate, you can want to hold the hand out of solidarity to people who are trying to make a better life for themselves. I understand that. I'm pro-immigration. I think Britain should take its fair share of refugees. But you simply cannot have this situation going on and on and on. It has to stop. You have to break the business model. You have to break the incentive for people to make those dangerous journeys across the Channel. And in the absence of anybody proposing any better solutions, then I think what the government has proposed deserves at least to be listened to. I mean, I'm in favour of offshoring for processing reasons. I think if people had their asylum claims validated, then I think we should take those people into our own country. But look, if you're not prepared to put a solution, then it undermines your own argument. You can't really expect people to take you seriously.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.